The letter hit the table like a death sentence. Pauline Brenner did not look at it again. She could not. The words were already burned into the back of her eyes, seared there by a single reading that had taken less than 30 seconds and changed everything she thought she knew about the man standing 6 feet away from her in the dusty kitchen of the Whitaker ranch house. Stephen Whitaker, tall, broad-shouldered, jaw set like carved granite, watched her with those dark eyes that had already undone her in 100 small ways over the last 4 months. Those same eyes that she had promised herself meant nothing to her. Those same eyes that were now holding a secret she had not been prepared for. "You knew," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she expected, which was somehow worse than screaming. "You knew who I was before I ever stepped off that stage in Crestfall." He did not deny it. That was the first blade. He just stood there, thumbs hooked in his belt, and the silence stretched between them like a rope pulled to its breaking point. "Pauline, do not." She held up one hand and was almost surprised it was not shaking. "Do not say my name right now, like that changes anything." The letter was from a man named Harlan Greer, a cattle broker out of Amarillo whose name she had hoped never to hear again. She had read the words twice in the space of a breath. He had written to Stephen 3 weeks before she arrived. He had described her. He had warned Stephen. He had used the word dangerous. And Stephen Whitaker, the man who had given her a job, a room, 3 square meals a day, and something dangerously close to a reason to stay in one place, had hired her anyway and had said nothing. That was the trap. That was the hidden motive she had been too trusting, too stupidly, helplessly trusting to see. She turned from the table and walked to the window because she needed something solid to look at, something that was not him, something that would not make her chest feel like a fist was closing around her heart. Outside, the Texas panhandle spread out gold and copper in the October evening light, the grass still, the windmill turning slowly against a sky going purple at the edges. Beautiful, achingly beautiful, and it had already become the thing she was going to have to walk away from. She told herself it was only a ranch job when she took it. She had told herself that every single day since. Every quiet evening had proved her wrong. She just had not been ready to admit it until now. Pauline had come to Crestfall, Texas in late June of 1882 with $17, a carpet bag, a reference letter from a widow in Abilene who had employed her as a housekeeper for 2 years, and a dark past she was running so hard from that she could practically feel it breathing on the back of her neck. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned severely because loose hair was a liability in honest work, and green eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they had a habit of seeing more than their owner intended. She had not come to Crestfall looking for anything except distance. Distance from Harlan Greer specifically, who had employed her late father as a ranch hand and who had then, after her father died in a branding accident that was not as accidental as anyone admitted out loud, tried to use the debt her father owed him as a leash around Pauline's neck. He had wanted her to cook for his crew, manage his household, be available in ways that made her stomach turn even now, 4 months later, to remember. She had left in the night with her bag and a borrowed horse she had returned to its owner in the next county before taking the stage west. The posting for a housekeeper and general hand on the Whitaker spread outside Crestfall had been tacked to a board in the stage station at Lubbock. The wages were fair. The description was sparse. She had written a letter and received a brief, businesslike reply from a S. Whitaker, ranch owner, that said the position was hers if she wanted it, and that she should arrive before the end of June because the summer work would not wait. She had not asked many questions. Questions invited reciprocal questions, and reciprocal questions were the enemy. The stage rolled into Crestfall on the 28th of June, a Thursday, and it was hot enough that the air itself seemed to waver and bend. Pauline climbed down with her carpet bag and stood in the street while the other 2 passengers collected themselves and dispersed, and she looked at the town with the practiced eye of a woman who had learned to assess places for their exits before she assessed them for anything else. Crestfall was not much, but it was something. A main street with a general store, a livery, a post office, a small hotel, a saloon called the Copper Kettle that she filed away and decided to avoid, a church at the far end whose white paint was peeling in the heat, and a sheriff's office with a faded star painted on the door. Population, she guessed, somewhere between 200 and 300 people. Far enough from Amarillo to breathe, close enough to civilization that she would not die of loneliness. Maybe. She was still standing there, recalibrating when the wagon pulled up. The man driving it was not what she had pictured from the businesslike letter. She had pictured someone older, someone with the creaking, weathered look of a man who had worked land long enough to become part of it. Instead, Stephen Whitaker was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark brown hair pushed back under a well-worn hat, a jaw that had seen a few days without a razor, and eyes the color of strong coffee that assessed her in a single swift glance with an expression she could not immediately read. He was not particularly handsome in the way that made a woman notice right away. He was handsome in the way she noticed later, slowly, when she had already decided not to look. He climbed down from the wagon and extended his hand. "Miss Brenner, Mr. Whitaker." They shook hands once briefly, like a contract being sealed. He took her carpet bag before she could object and loaded it into the wagon bed. She noted that he did not ask if she needed help. He just helped. She noted also that he did not look at her again in any way that required her to feel watched. She filed both observations away and climbed onto the wagon bench. "Ride's about 40 minutes, he said, taking up the reins. "Ranch sits on the east side of the creek, what they call Barrow Creek, though it's barely enough water to justify a name most of the year. I appreciate the warning. You cook, I can cook." He glanced sideways at her. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "That's not an answer." "It is an answer," she said. "It's just not the answer you were hoping for." He was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted in his expression, something almost like approval. "Fair enough." The ranch appeared as the road bent south and the scrub cedar thinned out, and Pauline saw it for the first time the way she would always remember seeing it. Golden in the late afternoon, the main house solid and square, built from cedar and stone, with a long porch across the front where 2 dogs lifted their heads and then settled again, too hot to be suspicious. Behind the house, a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and beyond everything the land rolling away in every direction toward a horizon that felt like the edge of the world. There were 3 ranch hands. She learned their names in the first hour. Willis, who was 50 and had a face like a crumpled map, and who immediately told her his opinions on the proper way to make biscuits. Tomás, who was Mexican and 22 and very quiet, and who communicated mostly through small, efficient gestures. And Clay, who was 28, red-haired and freckled, and who looked at her with uncomplicated friendliness that she found, after months of wariness, genuinely refreshing. She also learned in the first hour that there was no Mrs. Whitaker, that there had not been one for 2 years, and that the previous housekeeper had left to marry a man in Fort Worth, which was why the position was available. She learned this not from Stephen, who said almost nothing personal on any subject, but from Willis, who apparently believed strongly in comprehensive orientation. Her room was off the kitchen, small but clean, with a window that faced east so the morning light came in and woke her before any alarm was needed. There was a bed with a good mattress, a dresser with a real mirror, a washstand, and a hook on the door. It was more than she had expected. She sat on the bed that first night, listened to the silence outside, which was not truly silence but the particular layered quiet of open country, wind and cricket and distant cattle and the occasional creak of the house settling, and she said very firmly to herself that this was a job. It was only a job. She would do her work, save her wages, keep her past behind her, and in 6 months or a year she would move on somewhere else. Maybe Colorado, maybe New Mexico. Somewhere with mountains, where the landscape itself would feel like a wall between her and Harlan Greer and everything before. That was the plan. She kept to it reasonably well for the first 3 weeks. She cooked breakfast before dawn, managed the house, helped with mending and supply orders, and kept the books when it became clear within the first week that Willis had been doing a rough approximation of bookkeeping that was going to cause Stephen a problem come tax season. Stephen gave her the ledgers without ceremony and without condescension, which she appreciated more than she let show. She began to see that he ran the ranch with a particular kind of competence that was not flashy and not loud but was deeply, quietly effective. He did not waste words. He did not waste motion. But he also, she noticed, was not cruel in the small ways that powerful men often were without even recognizing it. He paid his hands on time. He thanked people for their work. He spent 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon getting the ranch's old milk cow unstuck from a muddy creek bank because Willis's back was bad, and he did it without comment and without expecting anyone to make a story of it. She noticed these things because she could not help noticing things, not because she was looking for reasons to feel anything. She was absolutely not looking for reasons to feel anything. The evenings were the problem. The summer evenings in the Texas Panhandle were long and amber-colored, the light lingering on the land long after any reasonable hour, as if the sun could not quite bring itself to leave. The work was done by 7, usually, and the hands went to the bunkhouse, and the house went quiet in a way that had its own texture and quality, warm and settled, and full of the smell of supper and wood smoke, and the particular dry sweetness of good Texas grass coming through the open windows. The first evening that Stephen came and sat on the porch while she was already there, she almost went inside. She did not, and she was not entirely sure why. She stayed in her chair and watched the sky turn colors while he leaned against the porch post with a cup of coffee and seemed to have no particular agenda beyond being outside. They did not talk much. He said that the north pasture fence needed mending by end of week. She said she had noticed the flour barrel was getting low and the next supply run should account for it. He said he would tell Willis. That was essentially the conversation. But when she finally went inside, she was aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature, and she told herself very firmly that it was simply because she had not had a quiet evening in a very long time, and quietness itself was the thing she was grateful for, not the company. Absolutely not the company. Every quiet evening proved her wrong. July came in hot and fierce, and with it came a problem she had not expected. A man named Denton Cole, who owned the neighboring spread to the north and who had been in a land dispute with Stephen over water rights to the North Fork of Barrow Creek for going on 2 years. Denton Cole rode onto the Whitaker property on a Wednesday morning with 2 of his men and placed himself in the yard with the comfortable posture of a man who has decided he owns more than he actually does. He was big, late 40s, with a silver mustache and the kind of money confidence that made him assume his requests were really demands. Pauline was coming from the chicken coop with a basket of eggs when he arrived, and she stopped at the edge of the yard and stayed still and quiet, which was a survival habit she had developed early. Stephen came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag, and the conversation that followed was short and intensely controlled on Stephen's side and increasingly aggressive on Denton Cole's. Cole wanted access to the North Fork. Stephen said the deeded water rights were clear and Cole knew it. Cole said he had friends in Austin who might see the deed differently. Stephen said that was Cole's business, but that Cole's men were currently standing on Whitaker land without invitation, and he would appreciate it if they corrected that situation before sundown. Cole looked at Stephen for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating, and then his gaze moved across the yard and landed on Pauline. He looked at her with a particular kind of assessment that made her want to step backward, but she did not step backward. She had learned not to, and she met his gaze steadily until he looked away. "New housekeeper," Cole observed to Stephen as if she were an object he was noting. "Miss Brenner," Stephen said, "who is not part of this conversation." Cole smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes, tipped his hat in Pauline's direction with an irony that made the gesture an insult, and then rode out with his men. The moment he was gone, the tension in the yard deflated like a punctured lung. Pauline walked to the porch and set down the egg basket. Stephen came to stand a few feet away. He looked in the direction Cole had gone for a moment, jaw tight. "Does that happen often?" she asked. "Often enough." He looked at her then. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I've met men like that before." He studied her for a moment. There was something in his expression that said he heard the weight in those words, that there was more story behind them than she had offered, and that he was choosing not to press. The choosing not to press was something she noticed, something she filed away beside all the other things she had filed away about him. "The water rights are legitimate," he said. "Cole knows it. He's just testing. What happens if he does more than test?" "Then we deal with it," Stephen said simply and went back to the barn. She watched him go, and then stood there a moment longer in the morning heat, with the eggs and the dust, and the awareness that she had just seen a man handle a threatening situation with exactly the kind of steady, deliberate calm that she had spent years longing to see from the men around her and almost never had, and that this observation was not helping at all with her firmly held position on the subject of not feeling things. She went inside and made biscuits and thought about Colorado and mountains and how she would be moving on soon. Definitely. Probably. August brought the cattle drive preparation, and suddenly there was not a single idle moment on the property from before sunrise to well after dark. Stephen brought in 4 extra hands for the drive, rough, competent men who mostly kept to themselves, and the ranch hummed with the particular organized chaos of a big operation moving. Pauline expanded the cooking operation to feed 12 men 3 times a day, which required a level of logistics that appealed to her systematic mind. She made arrangements with the general store in Crestfall, directed Willis on supply acquisition, and reorganized the kitchen so that production was faster and cleaner. And Stephen, when he noticed the reorganization, said simply and without elaboration, "Good thinking," which was approximately the highest praise she had heard him offer anyone about anything. She went with the drive for the first 2 days because the camp cook was a man named Ephraim who was 63 and had a knee that had been replaced in his body's filing system under the category of chronic complaint, and who needed another pair of hands at the chuck wagon. This had not been the original plan, but it became the plan when Ephraim showed up on the first morning gray-faced with pain and too proud to say he needed help. She had not been on a cattle drive before. The scale of it startled her even though she had been around cattle all her life. The sound of 200 head moving together was a sound that lived in the body, a low constant pressure, combined with the dust that rose to a permanent haze and the smell of horse and leather and grass churned to dirt. She did not have time to be startled for long, because there was work. Stephen checked on the chuck wagon at midday on the first day, a fast stop in which he swung down from his horse, took water, assessed the situation in about 6 seconds, and told her she did not have to stay if she was not comfortable. "I'm comfortable," she said, from behind a pot of beans that was bigger than her torso. He looked at her for a moment the way he did sometimes, as if he were reading something small and significant in her face. "Ephraim giving you trouble?" Ephraim was, in fact, giving her considerable trouble, in the form of unsolicited opinions on the correct seasoning of every dish she prepared. "Ephraim is a treasure," she said, which was technically not a lie. The corner of Stephen's mouth moved. She was beginning to identify that particular small movement as the closest thing he had to a laugh, most of the time. He remounted and rode back to the herd, and she watched him go, because she was looking in that direction anyway, and not for any other reason. She rode back to the ranch on the 3rd morning with a borrowed horse and a cook's burn on her left wrist, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that felt clean because it was earned. When she walked in through the kitchen door, the quiet of the house felt different than it had before she left. Fuller. Like something had been added to it while she was away, and she realized after a moment that the something was her own recognition of how much she had already, quietly, stupidly, irrevocably, begun to belong there. She sat down at the kitchen table and pressed her hands flat against the wood, and had a very serious internal conversation with herself that lasted approximately 45 seconds before she concluded that nothing had changed. She was not someone who belonged anywhere, and she needed to remember that. She believed this with decreasing conviction every evening that followed. September was when things changed, though she did not see it as a change at the time. She saw it as a series of small, unremarkable moments that only acquired meaning in retrospect, the way that, she supposed, most important things did. The first was a Tuesday when she was mending a fence along the kitchen garden, and she cut her palm on the wire, and the cut was deeper than it looked, and she was trying to wrap it herself with a strip of cloth that kept slipping, and Stephen came from nowhere, said nothing, sat down on the fence rail beside her, and simply took her hand and wrapped it properly with the strip she had been fighting with, his big, calloused hands working with a steadiness that was careful without being precious. And when he was finished, he held her hand for 1 second longer than necessary, as if he had forgotten to let go, and then he did let go, and they both looked somewhere else, and neither of them said anything. The second was a Friday evening when she came to the porch after supper to find he had brought out 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, and set hers on the small table between the chairs without making a ceremony of it, as if this had been the custom all along, and she sat down and accepted the coffee without making a ceremony of it either, and the evening settled over them like a blanket, and they talked for the first time about things that were not the ranch. He asked where she was from. She said she had moved around. He said he understood that. She asked where he was from, and he said he had been born in Virginia, had come west with his father at 15, and had taken over the ranch at 22 when his father died. She asked if he had family. He said a sister in Kansas City he wrote to sometimes. She did not ask more. He did not ask more. But when she finally went inside, she stood at her bedroom window and looked at the stars, and understood that a line had been crossed somewhere in the course of that conversation, and she was not sure she had been paying attention when it happened. The third was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of September when Denton Cole came back, this time without his men, which was somehow more alarming than before. He came at noon when the hands were eating in the bunkhouse and Stephen was in Crestfall for supplies. Pauline was alone in the house. Cole knocked on the door the way men knocked when they intended for knocking to be a statement rather than a request. She answered it. "Miss Brenner," he said, with that same smile that was not a smile. "I was hoping I might find Whitaker at home." "He's not available," she said, which was true and also technically uninformative about his location. Cole looked at her the way he had looked at her in the yard in July, but more slowly this time, and she felt the assessment of it like a hand she had not given permission to touch her. She did not move. She did not let anything show in her face. "I heard," Cole said conversationally, leaning one hand against the doorframe in a way that blocked part of the door without quite crossing into the house, "that you came from somewhere east of Lubbock, working for a fella named Greer before this." The name went through her like cold water. She kept her expression precisely still. "A lot of people work in a lot of places," she said. "Greer's a friend of mine," Cole said. He let that sit there. She let it sit back. After a moment she said, "Is there a message you'd like me to pass along to Mr. Whitaker about the water rights? I'll make sure he gets it." Cole studied her for another 3 seconds. Then he pushed off the doorframe and stepped back. "Just tell him I came by." She closed the door, turned away from it, and stood in the kitchen holding herself very still until she heard his horse leave. Then she sat down, and her hands shook for exactly 45 seconds, and then she stopped them, because she had practice at stopping that kind of thing, and she made herself a cup of tea and thought very hard about what Denton Cole knew and what it meant. She did not tell Stephen about the visit when he returned. She told herself she would, and then she did not, and she told herself she would tomorrow, and then tomorrow was busy, and then a week had passed and the moment had the weight of a secret without any of the original reasons for keeping it. She would come to regret this, but not in the way she expected. October arrived with a crispness that was welcome after the summer's assault. The mornings going cold now, frost on the grass some days, and the evenings coming in earlier and darker and, paradoxically, warmer, because they were spent inside by the fireplace in the front room rather than on the porch. This was another line crossed without ceremony. She had started banking the front room fire after supper as a matter of practicality, because the nights were cold and the house lost heat quickly. Stephen had started spending his evenings in the front room rather than his office because the fire was there. She had started bringing her mending to the front room because the light was better. And somehow, by the second week of October, it was simply where they both were in the evenings, on opposite sides of the fire, him with a book or accounts, her with mending or her own reading, and the silence between them was so thoroughly, dangerously comfortable that she no longer even bothered to tell herself it was nothing. She told herself instead that she would leave in spring, that the winter would be difficult on her own, and there was no shame in staying through winter for practical reasons. That this was still a job, and she was still a woman with a plan, and the plan had not changed. It had only been given a more sensible timeline. She was in the middle of believing this on an evening in the second week of October when the sound of a horse at speed brought her to the front room window, and she saw Clay riding in fast from the south, and the look on his face even at that distance was enough to know something was wrong. It was one of the cattle. A heifer had gone into the creek and gotten herself wedged in the rocks and was panicking, and in her panic she had already injured herself in the leg, and the situation was going to go bad quickly without more hands. Stephen was out the door in under a minute, and Pauline, before she had consciously decided anything, had taken her coat from the hook and followed, because 4 hands in a creek in the dark were better than 3, and she was not a woman who stood at windows when there was work to do. The creek rescue took an hour and a half, and involved all 4 of them, knee-deep in cold water in the dark with a lantern and a rope and a heifer who expressed her opinion of being saved with considerable vigor. Pauline was on the rope with Clay, and she braced her feet in the mud and pulled with everything she had. And when the heifer finally lurched free and scrambled to the bank, the relief of it made her laugh out loud, surprised and genuine, and Clay laughed too, and even Willis made a sound that was probably his version of laughter. She looked at Stephen, who was standing on the bank with muddy water dripping from him to his belt, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open and unguarded, the careful, contained look he usually wore entirely absent, and in its place something that she felt like warmth starting below her sternum and moving outward, something she had absolutely no appropriate name for because she had been refusing to name it for 4 months. Then the heifer shook herself and sprayed everyone with creek water, and the moment dissolved into movement and cold, and the practical problem of getting back to the ranch in wet clothes. She changed and hung her wet things by the kitchen fire, and when she came back through to say good night, Stephen was already in the front room, and she should have kept going to her room, and instead she sat down across from the fire and he looked up from whatever he had been looking at, which on closer inspection turned out to be nothing, just the fire itself, and she said, almost without meaning to say it out loud, "I'm glad I came here." The words hung in the air. He looked at her for a long moment with that same unguarded expression she had seen by the creek, and then he said, quietly, "So am I," and that was all. That was the whole conversation. But she lay in her bed that night with the ceiling above her, and the sound of the wind outside and her own heartbeat, which had apparently decided to stop being reasonable, and she understood that the plan had been ruined some time ago, and she had simply not been paying attention. 11 days later, she found the letter. She had been cleaning his office, which she did on Fridays, a quick dust and straighten because he kept it orderly enough that cleaning was more ceremony than necessity. The letter was on his desk, not in the drawer, not hidden, just there beneath a paperweight. She would not have read it at all if her eyes had not caught the name Greer, and once her eyes caught it they could not uncatch it, and she read it in the space of 30 seconds and then stood very still while the world rearranged itself around her. Harlan Greer to Stephen Whitaker, dated the 5th of June, 1882, 3 weeks before she had arrived. The letter said, "Word from Lubbock is you're looking for a housekeeper. I have information that a woman named Pauline Brenner, formerly of this area, may be passing through looking for work. She is capable and presentable, but I would advise caution. Her father left considerable debt in this county, and the woman herself left under suspicious circumstances. I would not hire her without careful consideration. She has a history that may cause you problems. If she comes to you, I'd suggest sending word to me at the address below before you make any decisions. A man with your reputation deserves better than the trouble she'll bring." Pauline read the letter twice, and the second time she read it, the words suspicious circumstances and trouble she will bring embedded themselves in her chest like splinters. She set the letter back on the desk precisely as she had found it, walked to the kitchen, and stood at the sink gripping its edge with both hands while she organized the information. Stephen had received this letter. He had hired her anyway. He had said nothing about it. For 4 months he had known that Greer wanted to keep track of her, that Greer had asked Stephen to send word of her whereabouts, and Stephen had not sent that word. She was fairly certain of that. She was still here and Greer had not appeared. But he had also not told her. He had let her believe she was safe, that nobody who knew about Greer knew about her and this place, when in fact one of Greer's friends was right next door in the form of Denton Cole, and her employer had known from the start that her past had followed her here. She waited until evening because she needed time to be certain of what she wanted to say. She needed her voice to be level. She needed the shakiness in her chest to subside, and she needed to decide how much of what she felt was anger at his silence, and how much was the older, deeper fear that she had been foolish to trust anything at all. When she came to the kitchen and he was already there, having come in from the last rounds, when she saw the letter still on his desk through the open office door, and said his name and walked to the table and picked it up and turned to face him. In that moment, she was not thinking about the 4 months or the creek, or the fireplace evenings, or what he had said when she told him she was glad she had come. She was thinking about her father's debt and Harlan Greer's handwriting and the word dangerous, and she was holding herself together by the sheer force of 4 months of practice. "You knew," she said. "You knew who I was before I ever stepped off that stage in Crestfall." And he did not deny it, and the silence was the first blade. "Pauline, do not," she held up one hand. "Do not say my name right now like that changes anything." He did not look away from her. He put his hands at his sides, which she recognized as him deliberately making himself less intimidating, giving her room, and under any other circumstances she would have noticed and appreciated that. Right now she needed him to just answer the question she had not yet fully asked. "Why?" She finally said, "If he warned you, why did you hire me?" Stephen was quiet for a moment. He moved to the table and pulled out a chair, not for himself, for her, and it was such an automatic, courteous thing that she wanted to be furious at him for it and could not quite manage it. She sat down. He sat across from her. "Because I know Harlan Greer," he said. She looked up. "I know him and I know the kind of man he is," Stephen continued, his voice level but not flat. She could hear something careful and controlled in it, something that was not detachment. "He bought cattle from me 2 years ago. While he was here, I watched how he spoke to his own people, to my hands, to the woman working in the hotel kitchen. I heard the way he talked about debts like they were property and about people like they were assets to be managed." He stopped for a moment. "When his letter arrived, I read the words he used about you, suspicious circumstances, trouble, and I thought about what I had seen of the man who wrote those words, and I thought about what those words probably meant coming from him." Pauline's throat was very tight. She did not speak. "I should have told you," Stephen said. "That's the piece I have no good excuse for. I should have told you from the first week that the letter existed, and what it said, and that I had made the decision to disregard it. I should have told you so you could decide for yourself if you wanted to stay somewhere Greer knew to look. I didn't tell you because he stopped again, and for the first time she saw something cross his face that was not composure but something more complicated, something that had the texture of vulnerability. Because I was afraid that if you knew, you would leave. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. That was selfish, he said, and I am sorry for it. Pauline looked at the letter in her hands, and then at the man across the table from her, and she thought about dark pasts and hidden motives and the word trap, which she had applied to this situation 20 minutes ago with absolute certainty. And she turned it over now in the new light of what he had just said, and found that it did not quite fit the shape of things as they actually were. A trap was something designed to hold you by deception. What Stephen had done was wrong in its silence, but its motivation was not the capture of her. Its motivation was the keeping of her. There was a difference. There was a difference that mattered enormously, even though she was still frightened, even though Greer's handwriting was still in her hands. Denton Cole came here in September, she said. When you were in town, he knows Greer. Stephen went very still. He mentioned Greer's name, she said. I didn't tell you because I was holding my own silence for my own reasons, and I realize now that is also what you were doing, and possibly neither of us has been helping the other the way we should have been. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, Are you all right? It was the same thing he had asked her in the yard in July after Cole's first visit. The same plain, direct question, the same absence of drama around it, just the real question underneath all the other things they were talking about. Are you all right? She considered the honest answer. She found it was more complicated than a single word, and she found also that for the first time, and she could not remember how long, she wanted to give the honest answer to someone. I was frightened when I found that letter, she said. Not of you. Of what it meant that someone from my past reached here before I did. And I am angry because I should have known. I think I should have been told. She paused. But I don't think you meant me harm. I didn't, he said. The two words were simple and absolute. I know, she said, and found, to her own slight bewilderment, that she did know. The silence that followed was different from the one that had stretched between them when she first confronted him. This one was not a rope pulled tight. This one was the aftermath of something, the air after a storm when the pressure changes and you can finally breathe. Stephen reached across the table and laid his hand palm up between them, not touching her, just there, an offer. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put her hand in his. That was all that happened. They sat there in the kitchen with their hands together on the table, and after a while she became aware that her own heartbeat had slowed from the frantic pace it had been keeping, and that the lamplight was warm on the wood, and that whatever she had been trying not to feel for 4 months was no longer something she was able to convincingly pretend she did not feel. What do we do about Cole? She said eventually, because the problem had not resolved itself while they were sitting here. I need to ride into Crestfall tomorrow and speak to the sheriff, Stephen said. I should have done it in July after his first visit. I was managing it too quietly. He looked at her. My fault that. I'll correct it. What about Greer? What Greer wrote in that letter is his opinion, Stephen said. It's his opinion about a woman who left a situation that I imagine no reasonable person would have stayed in. It doesn't have legal standing. If he comes here personally, that's a different matter and one I would address directly. But a letter from a man with a grudge and an inflated sense of ownership isn't something I'm going to let determine who works on my property or who stays in this house. There it was. The thing that she had been hearing in small ways for 4 months. The thing that was both simple and extraordinary. He saw her as a person with her own standing, not as an object of someone else's history. Not as the daughter of a dead debtor or a woman who had run from something or a liability to be managed. Just as herself, Pauline Brenner, who cooked and kept books and pulled cattle out of creeks and sat by fires and was currently holding his hand in a kitchen in Texas and had been, she could admit it now, falling in love with him somewhere in the long stretch between the last of June and this October night. She did not say that last part out loud. Not yet. What she said was, "I'll write to Greer myself." He looked at her with surprise that he did not quite conceal. "I have things I would like to say to him," she said, "about my father's supposed debt, which I examined in detail before I left and which I believe was inflated by about 300%. And about the terms under which he believed that debt entitled him to my person, which I would like to make it formally clear were never agreed to by me, and which I will be happy to repeat to anyone in Amarillo who cares to ask." Stephen was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is the most satisfying thing I've heard in a long time. It might not resolve anything immediately." "Maybe not, but it changes the ground under his feet, which is worth doing." She nodded. She looked at their joined hands on the table and then at him, and something shifted in her face that she did not try to control. "Stephen, I want to be honest with you." "I'd appreciate it," he said, and the tone of it was not teasing, it was genuine, the same careful gentleness he used for things that mattered. "I came here planning to leave," she said. "I planned to stay 6 months and save enough and go somewhere far enough that nobody's past could find me. I told myself every single day that this was a job, nothing more. That the evenings were just evenings. That you were just my employer. I told myself these things very consistently and with considerable conviction." He waited. "None of it was true," she said. "For a long time now. I don't know exactly when it stopped being true. I just know that it did." He looked at her with the unguarded expression she had seen twice before, once by the creek and once at the beginning of the confrontation before she understood what she was looking at. He looked at her with something that had been held carefully and was now being set down. "Pauline," he said, and this time she let him say her name. "I am not going to pretend I haven't felt the same thing. I'm not built for pretending, and I suspect you'd see through it regardless." She felt something in her chest that was warm and large and slightly terrifying. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go. I know you're resourceful and capable, and if you decided tomorrow to go to Colorado or New Mexico or anywhere else you'd manage. I want you to stay because this place is better with you in it and I am better with you in it. And I realize that's a significant thing to say, and I understand if, Stephen." He stopped. "I want to stay," she said. The quiet that followed was the kind that settles when something important has been acknowledged and does not need to be said again immediately. He lifted their joined hands slightly and turned his around so that his thumb moved across her knuckles, slow and deliberate, and she looked at it, and then at him, and the fire in the kitchen gave everything a warm orange quality like the evenings she had been hoarding in her memory for months. She wrote the letter to Harlan Greer the following morning, and she wrote it clearly and without apology. She documented the figures from her father's accounts, which she had kept copies of in the lining of her carpet bag, because she had been careful enough to think ahead even in the terror of leaving. She stated plainly that she would not be returning to Amarillo or to his employ, that she considered any debt her father had owed to be a matter between the two men and not her inheritance, and that if he or any associate of his attempted to contact her or harass her further, she would take the matter to the law in both their counties. She signed it with her full name and the address of the Whitaker Ranch, because hiding her location was no longer the point. Standing her ground was the point. Stephen read it before she sealed it. He handed it back and said, "Perfect," which was, from him, considerable. He rode to Crestfall that same afternoon and spoke to the sheriff, a steady, practical man named Beaumont, who listened to the account of Denton Cole's visits and his association with Greer and made notes, and said that he would be paying Cole a visit himself, and making clear that harassment of neighboring properties was something he did not intend to allow to continue. He also said, with a directness that Pauline would have respected if she had been there to hear it, that the nature of a debt left by a dead man was not transferable to his daughter by anyone's personal reasoning, and that if Greer or Cole tried to make it so, there were legal channels that would be very interested in the matter. The letter went out on the stage 2 days later. The response, when it came 3 weeks after, was short and unsatisfying in tone, but effectively a retreat. Greer wrote that he had no particular interest in Miss Brenner's whereabouts and that he considered the matter closed. The handwriting had the quality of a man writing through gritted teeth, but the words were the words she had needed to read, and she read them twice and then put the letter in the kitchen fire and watched it go. Denton Cole made one more appearance at the property line in November, this time on the correct side of it, and he and Stephen had a conversation that Pauline was not present for, but which Clay, who was, reported with considerable relish. Stephen had been precise, direct, legally informed, and entirely unmoved by Cole's bluster, and Cole had left with the look of a man who had decided this particular battle was not worth the cost. The water rights dispute went to the county clerk's office in January and was resolved in Stephen's favor by February, which was the outcome everyone with knowledge of the actual deed had expected, but which had needed the formal process to shut the door permanently. The ranch settled into the rhythm of fall and then winter, and Pauline settled with it, and the difference from all the previous settling she had done in her life was that this time the settling felt like choosing rather than landing. She renegotiated her position formally with Stephen in November. She would take over full management of the household accounts and supply coordination, which had been happening organically for months anyway, and her wages were adjusted accordingly. And they signed a paper that Stephen had drawn up himself that gave her specific responsibilities and terms, because he understood without her saying it that having things in writing made her feel less like someone who could be dismissed without standing. And having things in writing was something she would always value more than a handshake and a promise. The evenings continued, the front room fire, the 2 cups of coffee, the comfortable silences punctuated by conversation that moved, as trust deepened, into more significant territory. He told her about his father, who had been a hard man in the good and difficult sense, who had believed in work the way other men believed in Scripture, and who had built the ranch from almost nothing, and who Stephen had loved without always being able to talk to. She told him about her father, who had been gentle and somewhat impractical, and who had made bad financial decisions his whole life from a place of wanting to believe in people's goodness, and who she had loved without reservation, even when his decisions caused her problems. He told her about his wife, the one who had been, before she had not been. Her name had been Clara, and she had died of a fever in the summer 2 years ago, and he had spent the year after her death simply trying to keep the ranch running and not think too far ahead. She told him about the years between her father's death and the night she left Greer's property, the particular grinding quality of that time, the calculation required to stay safe and useful without becoming either invisible or a target, and she watched him listen with the quality of attention that made her feel seen in a way she had not been used to. "Remarkably good at surviving," he said one evening in late November, not as a compliment and not as an observation, but as something in between, something said with care. "I've had to be," she said. "I know." He looked at the fire. "I want you to be able to stop calculating exits for a while." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not something that happens overnight." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm not asking for overnight. I'm just saying the door is not a door you need to watch." She nodded. She looked at the fire and thought about doors and exits and the particular weight of always knowing where they were. And she thought that perhaps, maybe, slowly, she could begin to put some of that down. December came cold and brilliant, the sky going a particular hard, bright blue that she had come to associate with the Panhandle winters, and the ranch was beautiful in it in the way that things are beautiful when they have been stripped to essentials. The bare trees along the creek, the red barn against white ground after the first snow, the smoke from the chimneys going straight up in the still, cold morning air. She had not expected to find the winter beautiful, because she had always spent winters inside trying to stay warm and dreading the expense of it. This winter felt different. This winter felt like something she was inside of rather than something she was enduring. On Christmas Day, which was a clear, frozen Thursday with stars so bright the night before that they had cast faint shadows, Stephen came to the kitchen in the morning before anyone else was up and placed a small wrapped package on the table beside her coffee cup. She looked at it, and then at him with a combination of surprise and the particular wariness of someone not accustomed to being given things without strings attached. "It's not complicated," he said, with a gentleness that told her he understood the wariness without requiring her to explain it. She unwrapped it slowly. It was a small leather journal, good quality, dark green, with her name Pauline written inside the front cover in his handwriting. She ran her fingers over the letters. "You write things down," he said. "I've seen you. Notes and lists, and I thought you might want something specifically for the things that aren't lists." She looked up at him, and she could feel that the expression on her face was entirely unguarded in a way she had stopped being able to prevent around him. And he was looking back at her with the same. And she crossed the distance between them without really thinking about it and kissed him, briefly and warmly. And he kissed her back with a steadiness and a gentleness that was entirely him. And when she stepped back, they were both slightly undone in a way that neither of them appeared to mind in the least. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said, and his voice was lower than usual and his eyes were warm, and the kitchen was full of coffee smell and firelight, and outside the world was cold and blue, and she was not at all thinking about Colorado. The new year of 1883 came in with a windstorm that kept everyone inside for 3 days, which meant 3 days of enforced proximity and card games, and the reading aloud of newspapers that were 2 weeks old because the stage had been delayed. And Pauline discovered that she was good at poker in a way she had never had occasion to demonstrate, and that Clay, who considered himself an expert, found this extremely displeasing, and that Stephen watched her win with an expression of such unabashed satisfaction that she almost lost the next hand from laughing. Willis, whose observational powers were sharper than his shuffling suggested, looked at Stephen and then at Pauline after that particular evening and said, to no one specific, that it was about time, and then pretended he had said nothing and went to bed. In February, on a Sunday that was cold but still, Stephen asked if she wanted to ride out and see the north pasture that he had been planning to expand. This was a legitimate ranching question that could be answered without riding out together to look at it, and both of them knew this. And the fact that they both went anyway and rode side by side along the creek in the winter sun and talked about plans, his plans for the property, which had, gradually and naturally, begun to include her opinion as a matter of course, was something they both understood without needing to name. At the far end of the north pasture, where the land rose slightly and gave a view south across the whole of the Whitaker property, he stopped his horse and she stopped hers and they looked at it together, the ranch laid out below them small and complete and solid against the enormous landscape. "When I came here at 15, he said, my father pointed out this view. He said, we're going to make something here. He believed it the way he believed everything entirely without much qualification. He was quiet for a moment. He would have liked you. She felt the weight of that and held it carefully. What was his name? William, Will. Most people called him Will. What did you call him? Father, he paused. And then later, when I was old enough to feel the distance between us, sir, I regret that a little. She looked at him. He built something worth inheriting. That's its own kind of conversation between people. He looked at her with that quality she had come to know well, something shifting behind his eyes, something settled by her words in a way she had not anticipated. That's a good way to think about it. They rode back in the golden winter light, and she thought about things built and things inherited, and things made from scratch and the specific satisfaction of land that you had earned a right to care for. And she thought that she was not going anywhere, and the thought did not frighten her even a little. In March, when the first tentative warmth began pushing back the cold and the days started stretching again, and the grass began showing green at the edges of the brown, Stephen asked her to marry him. He asked her on the porch, in the evening, which was where important things between them seemed to happen. He had clearly thought about how he was going to say it, and the words came out careful and real. That he loved her, that he had known it for some time, that she had changed the shape of what he thought his life was going to be, and he wanted her to know that this was not an arrangement he was proposing out of practicality or convenience, that if she said no, he would respect it entirely, but that he believed she ought to know what he felt and what he was asking. She sat with it for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be present in the moment of it, to feel the full weight and warmth of being asked something this significant by someone she trusted this completely. "Yes," she said, without any qualification whatsoever. He laughed. It was a full, real laugh, the kind she had been hearing more of in the last months, and it made something in her chest open like a window. They were married in June of 1883, exactly 1 year after she had stepped off the stage in Crestfall with her carpet bag and her $17 and her firmly held plan to stay 6 months. The ceremony was at the church with the peeling white paint that had been repainted in April by a congregation determined to have something presentable, and the minister was a kind, earnest man named Reverend Abel, and the witnesses were Willis and Clay and Tamaz, and the sheriff, Beaumont, who had turned out to be a man with a genuine sense of civic feeling, and a woman named Dorothea Hatch who ran the general store and had become, over the course of the year, Pauline's closest friend in Crestfall. Pauline wore a dress that Dorothea helped her make, blue-gray wool with white at the collar and cuffs, practical enough to mean something and fine enough to feel like occasion. She carried a small bunch of early summer wildflowers, the yellow ones that grew along the creek bank, because they were what was available, and she liked them better than anything that needed to be ordered from somewhere else. Stephen wore his best coat, dark blue, and had made a genuine and visible effort with his hair, and when she walked to the front of the church and he turned to look at her, the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open and full and entirely present, and she felt it like light. Reverend Abel spoke the words, and they spoke their words back, and when it was done Stephen took both her hands and said, very quietly so that only she heard it, "Thank you for staying." She pressed her fingers against his. "Thank you for telling me why you should have told me sooner." He smiled. Actually smiled, the full version, not the corner-of-the-mouth version she had catalogued through the fall and winter. "I'll keep working on that." "So will I," she said. The celebration afterward was in the yard at the ranch. A long table that Willis and Clay had set up with considerable effort, and some argument about placement, loaded with food that Pauline had organized, and Dorothea had helped with, roasted meat and cornbread and beans and pickles and 2 pies, apple and peach, and a cake that Dorothea had made which was not entirely level but was entirely delicious. The evening was warm and the stars came out early and someone produced a fiddle. It turned out to be Tamaz, which was information nobody had previously possessed about him, and which he offered with a small, slightly shy smile. And there was dancing of the informal kind on the packed dirt of the yard, and Pauline danced with Stephen in the way of 2 people who have never really danced together but have no difficulty moving in the same direction, and she thought she might be the happiest she had been in her adult life. Which was a thought she had learned to trust. The summer of 1883 was busy and good. The ranch expanded. The North Pasture project Stephen had been planning came together, and with it, the need for additional hands in the fall, which required organization and planning that Pauline threw herself into with the satisfaction of work that was genuinely hers. She had stopped thinking of herself as the housekeeper some time ago. She was not exactly sure what the correct word was for what she had become in the operation of the property, but she knew that her opinion was sought and considered, and that the books were better than they had been, and that the supply arrangements she had made with the general store and the county supplier saved them money they could put into the cattle and the land. She wrote to her only surviving relative, a cousin in Missouri she had lost touch with during the years with Greer, and the response took 2 months but came, An 8-page letter full of news and warmth, and the evident relief of someone who had wondered what had happened to her. The correspondence became regular. She found that reconnecting to a thread she had thought lost was one of the unexpected pleasures of having a fixed address. In September, she told Stephen she was pregnant, and she told him in the kitchen in the morning before the hands were up, with the same directness she brought to most important things. He went very still for a moment, in the way he did when something mattered, and then he reached across the table and put his hand against her face with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and he said, "Are you all right?" She laughed. "I'm extremely well," she said. "I'm telling you because it's good news." "It is," he said, and his voice was not quite steady, and she found this remarkable and wonderful about a man who was generally extremely steady. "It is very good news." The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which she was grateful for, and she remained active and involved in the ranch operation through the winter, adjusting what needed adjusting and refusing to treat the situation as an incapacity, which was a position she and Stephen discussed once and then agreed on without further negotiation, because he understood that her sense of competence and purpose was not a thing to be managed on her behalf. In April of 1884, a Thursday morning when the peach trees along the south fence were beginning their first tentative bloom, she gave birth to a son. They named him William, for Stephen's father, which was Stephen's suggestion, and which she agreed to immediately and completely, because she understood what the name meant and the conversation it was. They called him Will, which was the name inside the name, and he was small and loud and absolutely clear about his opinions from the first hour, which Stephen observed with the expression of a man who is both delighted and slightly intimidated. Willis, when he was shown the baby the following morning, was characteristically succinct. "Looks like his mother," he said, which Pauline suspected was the highest compliment he could think to offer, and which Stephen agreed with entirely. The summer Will was born was one of the fullest summers Pauline could remember, full of work and warmth and the new texture of life, with a small person in it who required everything and gave back an extraordinary amount. She and Stephen moved through the days with the particular intimate cooperation of two people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough to coordinate without discussion. And the ranch kept running, and the hands adjusted to the changed household, with a matter-of-fact acceptance that she found touching. Willis, in particular, developing a fierce and entirely unacknowledged attachment to the baby that expressed itself in always happening to be nearby when the baby was being carried through the yard. She wrote in her green leather journal most evenings now, not long entries but consistent ones. What had been done, what needed doing, what had surprised or pleased or moved her. She had started to understand that writing things down was not just documentation. It was a way of insisting that the good things had happened, that they were real and worth recording, a habit she had developed partly as practical self-protection and had discovered was also simply good for the soul. In the journal, on a Wednesday evening in August when Will was 4 months old and asleep in his cradle in the corner of the front room and Stephen was reading across the fire, and the night was warm and the crickets were loud, and the smell of grass and dry summer earth came through the open window, she wrote, "I told myself it was only a ranch job, and every quiet evening proved me wrong. I have stopped telling myself things that are not true. It is a considerable improvement." She paused, then added, "There is no place I would rather be than here." She looked up from the journal and found that Stephen was watching her, not watching her write, but watching her face with the look she had come to know as the one that meant he was simply glad she was there. She had come a long way from being unsettled by that look. "What are you writing?" he asked. "The truth," she said. He smiled the full smile. "Good." The years that followed built on each other, with the particular satisfying logic of things that have been given the right foundation. The ranch grew steadily, not dramatically, but steadily, the way that things grow when they are tended carefully by people who understand both the work and the land. Stephen's approach to expansion was the same as his approach to most things: patient, methodical, and informed by a genuine understanding of what the land could support versus what ambition might push too far. Pauline's contribution to the operation expanded alongside the property itself, and by 1886, she was managing a set of supply contracts that covered 3 counties and had built a working relationship with a cattle broker in Lubbock, one with no connection whatsoever to Harlan Greer, that significantly improved their revenue per head. She heard about Greer exactly once more in those years. It was in the spring of 1886, a piece of news that came through Dorothea Hatch, who had a talent for receiving information in the way that general store owners did. Greer had been brought before the county court in Amarillo on a matter of fraudulent debt accounting, involving several families in his county who had, it turned out, very much the same experience as Pauline's father. The matter had not resolved in his favor. He had been required to make considerable restitution and had sold off a portion of his property to do so. His influence in the county was apparently much reduced. Pauline heard this on a Tuesday morning and said, "Good," with a completeness that Dorothea, who knew enough of the story to understand, matched with a nod that conveyed the full weight of the word. Denton Cole had relocated to New Mexico in 1884, a decision apparently motivated by a combination of the failed water rights dispute and 2 bad cattle years and his own general personality, which had not improved with time or proximity. The North Fork of Barrow Creek ran clear and undisputed through Whitaker property, and in dry years was more precious than it looked, and Pauline walked along its banks sometimes in the evenings with Will once he was old enough to walk beside her and not into the water, and she pointed out the birds and the particular fish that lived in the still pools, and the way the cottonwood roots reached the water, and Will listened with the focused, slightly solemn attention of a small person who is genuinely interested in understanding the world. He had Stephen's eyes, brown and steady, and her tendency toward observation, and between these 2 qualities he was both a joy and a challenge to know, which was, she had decided, exactly right. In 1887, when Will was 3, she told Stephen she was pregnant again in the kitchen again on a Tuesday morning before the hands were up, by now established as the time for important news in their household. He crossed the kitchen and held her for a long moment without speaking, and she felt the warmth of him and the steadiness that had been the first thing she had truly trusted about him, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and thought about everything that had not been the plan and how grateful she was. Their second child arrived in the October of 1887, a daughter this time, born on a clear, bright morning while the cottonwood along the creek was going gold. They named her Clara Ann, the Clara for Stephen's first wife as a simple and honest acknowledgement of what had come before, and the Ann for Pauline's mother, who had died when Pauline was young and whose name she had carried in a private place for a long time. The 2 names together felt like a conversation between past and present, and Pauline liked conversations like that because she believed the past deserved to be included rather than erased. Clara had Pauline's auburn coloring, and from the beginning, a personality that could most accurately be described as decisive, which meant that the household, which had already developed a certain character through the combined influences of its occupants, became something livelier still. Willis, by this point 70-something and a permanent feature of the property, in the way that the barn and the windmill were permanent features, held Clara for the first time with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered by joy and is not certain how to recover, and said simply, "Well," which in Willis's vocabulary was enormous. Tamaz had married a woman from Crestfall named Rosa in 1885, and they had built a small house on the eastern edge of the property, where they were welcome to stay as long as they wished, which from Pauline and Stephen's perspective was indefinitely. Rosa and Pauline had become close in the way of women who respect each other's competence and share a similar quality of dry, accurate observation about the world. Clay had eventually moved on to a ranch further north in 1886, departing with genuine warmth and returning for visits twice a year with his wife, who was a practical woman from Kansas he had met at a dance in Amarillo and who made Pauline laugh more readily than almost anyone. The community they had built, Pauline thought sometimes, was one of the things she was most proud of in her time at the ranch, because it had been built deliberately and carefully, out of the recognition that a place was made of people and not just land, and that the people deserved to be treated as the valued, full human beings they were. The spring of 1889 brought a letter from Stephen's sister in Kansas City, whom Pauline had corresponded with since the marriage and whom she had liked, through letters, immensely. The sister, whose name was Jane, had been widowed the previous year and was finding Kansas City expensive and the situation difficult. Pauline discussed the letter with Stephen one evening, and Stephen discussed it with Pauline, and the discussion was brief because they arrived at the same place simultaneously. Jane should come to the ranch if she wished to. There was room and there was work, and family should not be left to manage alone when they did not have to be. Jane Whitaker arrived on the stage at Crestfall in April of 1889, a small, red-haired woman in her late 20s with 3 trunks and a practical expression, and the kind of eyes that saw things clearly, which Pauline recognized as a Whitaker trait. She settled into the ranch with a speed that suggested she had been looking for a place that fit her and had found it. Within 3 months, she had taken over the schooling of Will and Clara, which had been happening piecemeal through Pauline's own efforts, and had transformed it into something structured and thorough that the children took to with enthusiasm, partly because their Aunt Jane had a gift for making things interesting, and partly because she had absolutely no tolerance for pretending things were more difficult than they were, which Will in particular found refreshing. On an evening in November of 1889, Pauline sat on the porch in the cold, clear air and looked at the ranch in the fading light and thought about June of 1882, which was 7 years ago and an entire life ago, and in some ways felt like yesterday. She thought about the carpet bag and the $17 and the firmly held plan. She thought about the stage rolling into Crestfall in the heat, and a man with dark brown hair and a worn hat climbing down from a wagon and extending his hand once briefly, like a contract being sealed. She thought about letters and hidden motives, and the word dangerous applied to her by a man who had never understood her, and about the particular quality of betrayal that is not malicious, but is still a wound that has to be tended. She thought about how she had stood in a kitchen with anger and fear running through her, and how he had sat across the table from her, and said the thing that was true and the thing that was sorry, in that order, and held his hand out palm up as an offer and not a demand. She thought about every quiet evening that had proven to her, consistently and without argument, that she was wrong about what this was, that it was not only a job, that it was not a temporary place or a temporary feeling or a careful plan, that it was, in fact, a life, her life, chosen and built and tended the same way you tended a ranch, with work and patience and the willingness to stay even when it rained, even when things went wrong, even when the situation required more than you had planned to give. The door opened behind her and Stephen came out with 2 cups of coffee, the same as always, and set hers on the small table between the chairs with the same ease he had always had, as if this had been the custom all along, which it had been, for 7 years now. He sat down and they looked at the last of the light together. Jane was reading to Will from that history book again, he said. He's going to know more about the Roman Empire than most people in this territory. He also already knows more about soil composition and water table management than most people in this territory, Pauline said. He's going to be fine. Clara drew on the kitchen wall again. What was it this time? A horse, I think, possibly a very ambitious dog. Pauline considered this. She's going to be an artist. She's going to be the end of the kitchen walls. Pauline laughed. It came out easy and full, the the way laughing came when you had had long practice at it with one person. Stephen looked at her with the expression that had not changed in 7 years, only deepened, the one that said he was simply glad she was there. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at the horizon, where the last gold of the day was going purple, the same color she had watched from this porch 100 times, 1,000 times, and would watch 1,000 more. "I'm thinking about staying," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had started doing years ago without making a ceremony of it, and she held on, because this was what she had learned to do, hold on to the things worth holding. The ranch was quiet around them in the particular layered way of open country at dusk, wind and cricket and cattle, and the sound of children inside the house, and the smell of grass and coffee, and the good dry sweetness of Texas air at the turn of the year. She had told herself it was only a ranch job. Every quiet evening had proven her wrong. She was grateful beyond measuring that it had. The years continued to add themselves to the life they had made, each one bringing its own texture of work and weather, and the small, important events that accumulate into a life fully lived. Will at 5 developed a passionate interest in horses that showed no sign of diminishing, and by 8 he was following Stephen around the corral with the focused attention of someone learning a language they intend to speak fluently. Clara at 4 was already the most direct person in any room she entered, which was something Pauline recognized with a mixture of amusement and pride as a quality she had perhaps contributed. The ranch house itself expanded in 1890, an addition Stephen built on the north end with help from a carpenter from Crestfall, adding 2 rooms and a proper study where Pauline kept the accounts and her correspondence and her green leather journal and its successors, 4 volumes now, lined up on the shelf above the desk. The shelf also held a photograph, taken by the traveling photographer who came through Crestfall in the summer of 1888, of the 2 of them on the porch with Will between them, Stephen's hand on Pauline's shoulder, and all 3 of them squinting slightly into the summer sun. It was not a perfectly composed photograph, but it was a true one, and she valued true over perfect in all things. The community of Crestfall grew slowly through these years, the way frontier communities grew when the initial wildness of a place settled into something more established, more layered, with schools and civic organizations and the particular local politics of people who had decided they were staying. Pauline became involved in the school board in 1891, which was a natural extension of the educational concerns she already had for her own children, and for the understanding that what was good for her household was not separable from what was good for the community around it. She was clear-eyed about the injustices she saw around her, in a territory where Mexican families like Tomás and Rosa's faced a prejudice that was woven into the everyday functioning of the law and the land market and the social structure, where the rights of long-established communities were regularly subordinated to the interests of newer arrivals with more political influence. She spoke about these things when it was useful to speak and worked on them quietly when speaking would not help, and she and Stephen were consistent and deliberate in how they ran their own property. Equal wages, equal dignity, and the firm position, stated plainly when necessary, that the people who worked on Whitaker land were people whose rights were not optional. This was not always comfortable, and it was not always popular with certain people in certain parts of the county, and neither Pauline nor Stephen spent particular time worrying about that. In the spring of 1892, Jane met a man. His name was Henry Marsh, a schoolteacher from a town 20 miles east who had come to Crestfall for a school board meeting and been introduced by the superintendent, and who spent the duration of the meeting stealing glances at Jane, with the expression of a man who has just understood something important about his own situation. He was gentle and rather scholarly, and had the kind of humor that was very dry and arrived late, and Jane liked him from the 3rd meeting, and loved him from the 5th, and married him in August on a morning that was clear and hot, at the same church with the repainted white walls, with Pauline and Stephen as witnesses, and Will as a very serious ring-bearer, and Clara as the least formally contained flower girl in the church's history. Pauline danced with Stephen at the wedding celebration and thought about their own wedding 9 years ago, and about what 9 years of choosing each other in small ways every day actually accumulated into, which was, she thought, something rather extraordinary and ordinary in equal measure, which was exactly as it should be. Jane and Henry settled in Crestfall, Henry joining the school as its head teacher and Jane continuing her tutoring work, which expanded as the town grew. They had a daughter the following year, which made Will and Clara's enjoyment of being cousins a subject of considerable domestic interest. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, June of 1893, Stephen and Pauline sat on the porch in the summer dusk, as they had sat on so many evenings, as she had known from somewhere in the first weeks of her time here that she would keep sitting, though she had argued against knowing it for as long as she could. The children were in bed, or supposed to be, and the sounds of the ranch at night were as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat, and the sky was layered with stars in the way it got on clear summer nights, not a few stars but genuinely all of them, the whole enormous system of them, visible in a way that the open country made possible. He had given her something for the anniversary, a bracelet made by a silversmith in Amarillo, simple and fine, and she had given him a new set of account books she had ordered specifically from a bookmaker in Kansas City, which was perhaps not a romantic gift in the conventional sense, but which was exactly the right gift for them, practical and specific and made with knowledge of what was actually needed and valued, which she had decided long ago was the highest form of gift-giving. 10 years, he said. Yes, he looked at her. The coffee cups were between them and the porch was cool in the way summer evenings could be in the Panhandle when the heat released after dark. Any regrets? She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave all questions. None, she said. Not one. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "When you found that letter, the night we argued, I was afraid you were going to leave, and I was afraid because—" He paused in the way he still sometimes paused when he was saying something that mattered and wanted to say it right. "Because I already knew by then that you were the most honest, capable, extraordinary person I had met in my life, and that this place was better for having you in it in a way that went well beyond practical utility. And the thought of you leaving because I had been too cowardly to trust you with the truth," he shook his head slightly, "that's not something I want to carry." "You don't have to carry it," she said. "It was 10 years ago and we have been honest with each other since." "We have," he agreed. "That's the thing about good people," she said. "They can make a mistake and then be different. That's what makes them good, not the absence of mistakes, the correction of them." He looked at her for a moment with that open expression, the one that had never stopped being the most affecting thing she had seen on a human face, and then he said, "I love you, Pauline. That is an unchanged and entirely reliable fact." "I love you," she said, with the ease of someone who has said something often enough that it has worn into the shape of the truest thing, smooth and certain. "That is equally unchanged and entirely reliable." The stars turned slowly overhead and the ranch was quiet around them, and inside the house their children were sleeping and their life was full and real and all of it, every complicated and beautiful and hard-earned piece of it, was hers. She had told herself it was only a ranch job. She had been wrong, beautifully, completely, gratefully wrong, and she had been proving it to herself every quiet evening for 10 years, and she intended to keep proving it for every quiet evening that came after, for as long as the evenings came, which she thought, holding her coffee cup in both hands and watching the stars and listening to Stephen breathe beside her in the warm summer dark, was all she had ever really needed. This, right here, this was all of it. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and she was home.